to the Farm to School podcast, where you will hear stories of how youth thrive and farmers prosper when we grow, cook, and eat delicious, nutritious local foods in schools.
We're your hosts, Rick Sherman
and Michelle Markestein. We are Farm to School coordinators for the state of Oregon. Today's guest is actually resident co-host Rick Sherman. Hi, Rick.
Hello. Hi.
Hey, y'all. I asked to interview Rick, and it's not because we couldn't get anyone else on the show today, but because Rick is one of my Farm to School heroes. Hi, Rick.
Hi.
So he's
Back
smiling.
at you. Thank you.
You can't tell.
No.
So I really wanted to share your story, and also I think it's great for folks to know who are hosting these Farm to School podcasts. Why you?
Thank you. First off, let me just say I've always felt like I have the best job in the world, and I really feel that with every fiber of my being. So maybe you'll find out why in my journey. So yeah, I started my journey. I've been told is an interesting one. So I don't know if everyone else will think that, but I started back. I grew up in a coastal town in Washington State. Anacortes is its name, and we were the original Seahawks, my high school team. I think it was formed in 1909 or something like that. But I grew up in a sleepy little town and fishing town, and I worked in high school. I got a job with the Washington State ferry system as a dockboy. And so interesting. I mean, it was extremely physical, hard work, but I loved it. It was so fun. I worked typically graveyard shifts, loading the boats with food, and I would load it with the food with like kegs of beer, and I would have to throw them in a dumbwaiter and run up and unload it, and the dumbwaiter would break down, and I'd have to load a keg of beer up 3 flights of stairs. And let me tell you, those things are heavy, and I was a scrawny 170-pound kid, and you can't lift. If you lift it wrong once, that's it for your back. So you have to learn to lift correctly, and so I would do that. But interesting story, I have 2 reoccurring dreams all the time as an adult, and that is one of them. Like, I'll wake up in a cold sweat and going, I got to get a case of French fries to the Cleat and get a keg of beer to the Elwha, which are boat names. They're boat-specific dreams. Weird. But it was fun. It was a fun job as a kid. So I won't tell you what the other reoccurring dream. That's for another podcast. But
so how did that go into food? Is that how you got into food service?
Yeah, it actually was. So it was through a company. It was named Saga at the time, and why I bring that up is because Saga sold out that company to Marriott, the hotel chain, and then Marriott sold out to a company called Sodexo. And so for those of you who don't know, Sodexo they operate a lot of school food services.
All over the country.
All over the country, yeah. And in Oregon, where we're from. So we lost the account, is what they called them. There, as a new provider came in for the ferry system, and they told me that I could, because presumably I was good at the time. I worked my way up from being a dock boy to being a manager. So a manager who runs the
Mr. Manager.
Yeah, I put on a tie back in those days and ran around in the boats and worked long hours, 7 days a week, actually, for months. It was crazy, but. No, so they said you can move anywhere in the country in the same line of work, which was corporate food service. So running cafeterias for like Digital, Honeywell, Hewlett-Packard's, those types of things. So I chose Arizona, Phoenix, because I had really always wanted to go there and watch spring training baseball. That was my reason. So I was newly married, and so we went down there. I had my first kid, Alex, hello out there, my son. We had him down there, and I realized it was like living on the surface of the sun. It was extremely hot, 119 degrees in the summer at times. So it was too hot for me, a Northwest boy. So I had an opportunity to move a little north to Colorado Springs, and I was there 3 years. I had our daughter, Stevie, and And again, I just started getting homesick, and our kids wanted to know who their grandparents were, and vice versa. So I wanted to come back home to the Pacific Northwest. So the options at the time were to go to downtown Seattle, which I just really didn't want to do the big city vibe, but I had an opportunity to go to Corvallis, Oregon, to work at the Hewlett-Packard there. And so I did that. And again, another, extremely hard job. I mean, working 7 days a week a lot of times, sometimes long hours. I worked 36 hours straight one day. It was crazy. And I had an opportunity. Somebody told me, hey, you should really try out schools. The Sodexo had schools. And so I was able to transfer out of that back in 1993 or 4 or something like that. But I started working for the school situation.
So that's how you ended up in school food service. But I often hear you say that the cafeteria can be a crucial part of education system. And I'm just curious, where did your love of education and learning come from?
It's probably come from the fact that I actually went to school. I have a degree in education, a K-12 degree.
Wow. Did you ever teach?
No, I never did. That's kind of interesting too, I guess. So when I was working in the ferry system as a manager, and I was going to school full time, and I'd come back home to Anacortes and work on the weekends on the boats. But I went to school up in Bellingham at Western Washington University. Go Vikings! But I went there, and I went there with a goal to run. I was a runner for 40 years. I don't run anymore, unfortunately, because I have a new hip installed. But yeah, so I don't run. But back then, I ran in high school. I ran cross country and track. And so I got on the team at Western. I ran cross country, track, and actually the marathon. The marathon was a season, an event in the track season. So I got to do that. And if I got an education, that was fine. So what I ended up doing was just doing what I liked. I liked teaching. I wanted to coach kids someday, which I had the opportunity to do. I could tell you about that later. But I got a degree in education. My coach, Dr. Ralph Vernacchia, was a pretty world-renowned sports psychologist, and he was in the education system, and I really wanted to learn what he did. So I ended up majoring in physical education, minoring in sports psychology through him. So I did that. But as a young adult, like 22 years old, I was making pretty good money with doing what I was doing in the ferry system. And the thought was, well, I'll just do this while I'm looking for a job. And I ended up going to Arizona, and I thought, well, I can always do that. I have this degree, but I was having fun. I was managing these cafeterias, and I kind of like doing it. So I just kept doing what I was doing.
So what does a school food service director do?
A school food service. Well, so when I moved to the schools in Oregon, I came to Oregon. I had the opportunity. For 20 years, I was a food service director in Oregon. I started out in a little community called Dallas, and that's just outside of Salem, a little bedroom community outside of Salem, Oregon, our state capital. And then after 10 years, I went to Albany School District, and I went to Eugene. I was there for 6 years, and I went to Eugene for 3 years. So during that time, I also was able to coach cross country and track for 20 years. And so I really had a lot of fun doing that and teaching the kiddos. But to your question, what does a school food service director do? They manage the employees. I had as many as 150 employees in Eugene. All the human resource issues that come up with that. They plan the menus. They order the food. It's quite a puzzle to try to get all the food out in the many different menus to the different schools, the different levels. You have to follow all the USDA regulations. And so it's just, it's a lot of work, but it was rewarding. It was fun.
And so then how did you get interested in serving local foods as part of that big puzzle?
Yeah. So about I think it was 2010, 2009, 2008, actually. I was in Eugene, and the farm to school movement started. Well, I guess it was born then. It started happening and coming to the forefront. And so we had this Oregon Farm to School and School Garden Network. They started having these small meetings of like 30, 40 people, of key people, food service directors, some nonprofits getting together and telling about getting local food into the schools. And where I was in Lane County in Eugene, it was a big deal to the people down there. So I started working with some parent groups and thinking, I always like to say, or how do we get to yes? The answer might be no, but how do we get to yes? So I started thinking, this sounds really cool. And the more I got into the local food, it was fun. Everyone won. The kids got local food. They got to learn where their food was coming from. The local farmers won. I started getting into that, and I became a master gardener. And I think the next thing you knew, it kind of took over my life in a really good way. I knew I wanted to do more of that. The farm to school stuff was fun stuff that happened after work for me. And really before long, then the state position opened up, Department of Ed. So I kind of one day quit my job and started doing what I'm doing now.
So you went from being a champion and supporting school gardens, but what does that mean that what you're doing now? Why don't you tell us about your current position and what you do there?
So this was a brand new position with the Oregon Department of Education. It was new. There was a person in there that was there for about 9 months. Her name was Joan, and she retired. There was a job freeze, so it was vacant for a while. But at the time, there weren't very many positions like this, a state agency position in the country. It was one of the few where they thought, and I remember interviewing for this, and I think you were on my interview panel. At the time, Michelle was my counterpart for Oregon Department of Ag. So we had two state agency positions, Department of Ag and Department of Ed. But I remember my interview, and they said, Rick, we knew what you did in Eugene, and we love for you were successful getting local food into the schools, telling your story, teaching the kids about local food, and we would like for you to duplicate that. You already know school boards, you go to school board meetings, you know teachers, you know principals, you know the system. So it'd be nice to duplicate that across the state. And so that was the thought. I jumped into it, and I guess the rest is history. They hired me, and we started doing that. I did a couple things right off the bat. The first thing I wanted to figure out was how many school gardens we had. And we were the first state to map all of our school gardens. What I actually did was I called every school in the state, 1,300 schools from Amity to Yoncalla, Oregon. And I called the main line and talked to the admin person there and said, hey, do you have a garden? And they would say, well, we have roadies out front. And I'm like, no, do you have carrots in the ground? So they would say, oh, yeah, we do, or we don't. So I'd say, okay, do you have somebody's in charge of that garden so I could get their contact information? So that first iteration, it took me 20 minutes a day for about 3 months to figure out we had 283 school gardens. So then we had all this data of contacts. So I sent them information for a survey, and we've been doing that ever since. And I've been in my position 12 years now. And so now we have 788 gardens. Over half of our schools have a garden of some kind or another, and all this data to match.
So how do you help them as a state agency support school gardens?
Well, at the time, it morphed into this thing. Like I said, we have the Oregon Farm to School and School Garden Network, and there was about 40 people. But once we had this database of school garden coordinators, we started emailing them out saying, hey, we have an annual meeting. Well, that annual meeting turned from a meeting from 40 people to 200, and then 400 people. Now, a lot of it was because of this list, but a lot of it too was just the farm to school movement just started taking off too. So I can't really take all the credit for that, but as much as I'd like to. But I guess the answer to your question is being there to support the school garden people, to work in the schools to teach kids about local food. The cafeteria is a classroom. So we say farm to school is the 3 C's too: the cafeteria, the classroom, and the community. The classroom being the school garden. So getting kids outside, we say no child left inside. so we can get kids out and breathing, and you can teach any subject in a school garden. But also one of the things I did when I first got there, they said, well, we have this grant to run. It was a little fledgling grant at the time of $200,000, which $200,000 is a lot of money, but it didn't go very far across the whole state. So we had a grant to teach kids, or actually it was a competitive grant. We had 9 schools apply that first year in 2012. And it was for reimbursement for Oregon grown and processed food to go to the cafeterias and to teach kids about that food. And so we started having success with that. It grew from 200,000 to 1.2 million to 4.5 million to 10 million to 15, and then it got reduced back down to 10. And so that's where we're at right now. We've pretty much solidified. We're at $10 million, and we've been running this grant since then, for 12 years now. And we've actually been able to push the procurement side of this, the reimbursement of the Oregon grown foods, out to all schools and child and adult care food programs. So pre-K kids and K through 12, all the kids get to take advantage of getting local food in the schools. And then the other part of that, so that's 5.2 million is for the food. And then 3 million of it is for the education. It's a competitive grant to teach kids about that food.
So for those of you who are unfamiliar with what does a state agency do related to farm to school and school gardens, Rick gave us a lot of lists, but just big picture, like taking a 10,000 foot view of it, is that the Department of Education and Agriculture work to reduce barriers to getting local foods to schools and, getting kids out in school gardens and learning about agriculture, food, nutrition. And then they also create opportunities. So what I've watched you do, Rick, is whenever something comes up, like a barrier is identified, like, oh, you can't eat school garden produce. That's not safe. You laugh, but you respond. You create a produce safety policy and get that out to schools. So that's like a really good example of reduce barriers, create opportunities.
Yeah, thank you. That was the second thing I did, actually. The first was identify the gardens. And when I asked my boss about school garden produce, she said, oh, we have a policy. We don't really okay that at the time because they didn't know if school garden produce was safe. And I'm like, well, I have a background in what they call HACCP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. It's what the schools use in NASA. Actually, NASA used for their space program to make food safe. So I have a background in that. But I said, well, let's just make it safe by figuring it out. And so I went about making this training and documentation manual that our health departments in Oregon actually signed off on. And so, I was pretty proud of that.
Lots of millions of dollars in money and grants sound super fancy, Rick, but what does that actually look like for kids and farmers?
Let me give you an example, a story that I think really hits home when I was a food service director. So I got a call one time from a school garden coordinator in Eugene. I think it was Camas Ridge Elementary. And they said, hey, we have a half pan of lettuce from our garden. We would love to put on the cafeteria line. And this is kind of interesting because I get a lot of comments from food service directors, even in this day and age, that say, we just don't have enough garden produce to make it worthwhile to put on we have 500 kids at our school, and if you have a half pan of lettuce, they can't all eat that half pan of lettuce. So that was the case at this school. So what we did is we supplemented it. Every kid got a couple pieces of that lettuce on top of their lettuce that came from the food service truck. So everybody got to have some. But what happened was we advertised it. we put it on the morning announcements. We sent notes home to parents saying, hey, your school garden produce will be featured on the salad bar. And I had a communications department that got a hold of that. And so I showed up for that day, and we had 3 television stations there, local TV stations. We had the local newspaper, and we had NPR covering that half pan of lettuce. So I always say that as a rebuttal, if you will. Like if a food service director says, we don't have enough lettuce to make a difference. Boy, that one, I mean, normally we have had 70% participation at that school, but that day, I think we were at 99. Everybody bought a lunch that day.
What does participation mean?
Oh, sorry. That's just the amount of kids that come and buy a school lunch that participate in the National School Lunch Program.
So usually 70% came, and then how many came for the half pan of lettuce?
It was like 99. It was everybody. It was crazy.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So obviously the word was out. You talked to your communications department, and what else happened? Will you tell me more about that?
So the moral of the story is to tell your story. I sometimes say that don't even bother to do farm to school if you don't tell your story. And in this case, we talked to a guest a while ago that said if you just put your food out, the kids will notice it and they'll make a difference. But if you tell the story, they will make the connection and devour the food and make lifelong healthy choices. So that's why I really believe in telling your story and communicating and doing the marketing behind your farm to school program.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing your story with us today. And from your perspective, what are some things that people can do to be more involved in farm to school and school gardens?
A bunch of things, really. I think the first thing to do is just go have lunch with your kid, for one thing, and see what your school lunch is like. A lot of times people don't know. And so that's a good way to find out. And then you can see if, hey, do we have a school garden at your school? You can volunteer there. You can, in your state, you probably have a farm to school network you can join. You can Google that. And I guess in our show notes, we could put down, we have a national farm to school network, and there's a link to find the key people in your state. In Oregon, we have the Oregon Farm to School and School Garden Network, and we have regional hubs all over that really connect the people really well. And then you can meet the food service director, meet the school garden coordinator if there is one. You can plug in at the local level or the state level. There's so many options.
Well, that sounds really easy and fun to get involved, Rick. Thanks for those suggestions. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Farm to School was written, directed, and produced by Rick Sherman and Michelle Markestein and was made possible by a grant from the United States Department of Agriculture.
The content and ideas on the Farm to School podcast does not necessarily reflect the opinions of Oregon State University, Oregon Department of Education, and the United States Department of Agriculture. The USDA, Oregon Department of Education, and Oregon State University are equal employment opportunity employers.
Do you want to learn more about farm to school and school gardens? Check out other episodes, show notes, and much more at rootopia.com, rootopia.com. Rootopia is a project of Oregon State University.
Or do you have an idea for a future podcast? Please send us an email at info@rootopia.com.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for listening.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.